Hi, I'm Brit Garner.
And I'm Rob Spall.
Welcome to Nature Insight.
Speed dating with the future. The science and policy of biodiversity might sound quite removed from our daily lives, but nature really underpins every aspect of our well-being. Speed dating with the future simply means finding new ways to appreciate nature's contributions to all of us in half-hour episodes. In our first episode of this season, we caught up with the crew of a modern-day voyage of discovery, retracing the explorations of Charles Darwin, to help draw attention to the global biodiversity crisis and the many different kinds of actions being taken by people around the world to address the degradation of nature.
The leader of the Captain Darwin Project, Victor Ralt, shared with us his personal journey from pessimism to action, making the point that nature is among the most powerful sources of joy and happiness.
And that brings us very directly to the core of our episode today, the many different and vital benefits that we all derive from nature beyond the obvious.
Indeed. One person who has spent her career looking into the less obvious ways that nature adds value to human lives is Rachelle Gould, Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at the University of Vermont in the U.S.
So some of my favorite work in this realm is the Pew Center, which does a lot of very rigorous polling in the United States and around the world. And they periodically ask this question: what makes life meaningful to people? And around the world and across a lot of different studies, family is number one. But what's really exciting and important for people who look at nature is that nature and time outdoors is often second. And that's pretty powerful.
I agree.
So I think one way that I think we think about it in the field is there are sort of two bins of ways that nature impacts us, and they intertwine all the time. But there's quite a bit of research on the sort of psychological or physiological side. Lots of evidence that nature, for instance, reduces stress, it reduces blood pressure, it improves mood, it improves cognitive function. There's also a whole suite of benefits, and I work more on this second suite of benefits that are related to those things, but maybe like taking a step up or bigger, sort of what are the implications of those things. And those are things like that nature really is related to what it means to live a fulfilling life.
And I wonder who benefits the most from this kind of exposure. I'm curious about differences between, rural versus urban context, or even younger versus older humans. What do you think about that?
I think there's less research on differences between people than there could be. But I think one big difference that comes up is the difference between rural and urban communities, and just the very different way that people in rural areas and people in urban areas are interacting with nature. And so you have to sort of talk about those benefits differently in urban areas, because in urban areas, nature tends to be kind of discussed as being in these green spaces that are sort of separate from the human space. Obviously, we have things like street trees and sidewalk plantings, that kind of thing that are I would say definitely part of nature, but are sort of harder to analyze. So I think in urban areas, there's a lot of discussion about how much greenery there is around you. And in rural areas, it's a really different conversation, because in rural areas, greenery or nature, quote unquote, is really everywhere. It's much more predominant in terms of land cover. And so the way that we think about how people interact with nature in rural areas is really more, it's integrated with everyday life in many ways. And so the question is, in what way are people interacting with nature? Instead of thinking about the kinds of people maybe who interact with nature and how the benefits differ, I think it's helpful to consider how you're interacting with nature, and that the benefits from nature can vary depending on how you're interacting. In the context of like someone who's going out to spend time in nature, to enjoy nature, to recreate in nature, there are different ways you can do that. And you can do that in ways that are really sort of mindful of nature and really attentive to nature. Studies that have investigated this find that the benefits of nature are stronger, perhaps unsurprisingly, when you're more fully present. We then move to a more sort of working landscape context, where people are interacting with the landscape in a way that they're working with the landscape. So farmers, ranchers, forestry professionals, fishermen. There's less study of the quote unquote benefits of nature in those cognitive and psychological ways in populations that are spending their working lives interacting with nature. And I think that's almost certainly happening from evidence we have elsewhere, but we don't normally study those populations, which is really interesting. Research that I've done specifically that perhaps relates most closely to that psychological type of mental well-being work is on this idea of perspective from nature. And this is something that we first saw in work that I and another colleague had done in Hawaii, working with people, talking to them about both the forest and about agricultural systems in Hawaii. And we sort of looked at this idea of cultural ecosystem services or benefits from nature that are non-material. And one of those benefits is something that we called perspective from nature, which is this idea that nature gives us a more accurate sense of sort of who we are and where we fit in relation to the rest of the world. It's really associated with humility, with sort of diminishing the importance of one's personal problems when in nature, realizing that these things that may seem really overwhelming to me when I'm sort of only in myself, once I get out into nature and I see that this tree is hundreds of years old, and this rock is millions of years old, or this tree is gigantic and it makes me feel very small. And interestingly, that could seem like it sort of makes you feel worse, it makes you feel small, but really that's not the way people talk about it. That humbling is very grounding and very comforting. I think this idea of perspective is really fascinating to me because it is this bridge between a very individual psychological mental process that we probably could measure if we tried. We haven't necessarily tried, but that it also connects to spirituality. It also connects to these ideas of sacredness and getting outside of yourself and connecting to the larger picture that we are pretty sure we can't measure that.
This resonates so much with me. One of my favorite places on earth is Makoshika State Park in the Badlands of eastern Montana, where there is actually exposed KPG boundaries, so the rocks where we had the dinosaurs go extinct. So one of the few places kind of on land on Earth where it is easily accessible, and so you literally just 10-minute hike and you're there with the rock layers, seeing the immense loss of these things we dream of, these dinosaurs, but then recognizing that whoa, we are here because of loss, the way that evolution and life on Earth and biodiversity happens, we lose and we gain. And for me, there is nothing more humbling and grounding than thinking through something like a mass extinction event and having access to that place. I know for me, my life is better because of that place that exists and my moments there.
I love that example because there are multiple kinds of perspective there, and this putting yourself into the chain of evolution. I really like that example, especially because another thing I'm really interested in is how these values and these benefits interact with knowledge. Part of the reason that's so powerful and that experience of being in this place is powerful for you is that you have some scientific knowledge, right, about the way evolution has occurred and the history of species and how species have evolved. And so I think that's a really neat example that captures how our deeply rooted values and sense of wonder and sense of wow, I am part of this huge thing, in that case is really interacting with knowledge that you have.
And it's also beautiful. That's the beautiful thing. As you mentioned, if I didn't know anything about it, I would still be this is one of the most beautiful hikes I've done. Look at this landscape. So it's so cool that both exist. Obviously, you and I deeply feel and think about these things. I know both of our lives and the work that we do is impacted by this idea of exposure to nature and these non-material benefits. I'm curious about incorporating that into these, lasting benefits, whether that means within educational systems or within healthcare systems. What might some of that look like? How do we sort of incorporate those values and also this exposure to nature?
So a couple of ideas there. One is in the healthcare realm. There's a really interesting new initiative, a few years old now, that involves park prescriptions. So that's in a medical context, prescribing people to spend time in nature. So there's an organization in the US called Park RX, sort of RX being the prescription. Canada also has an emerging organization. Very impressed and very excited by this movement to say, hey, doctors, instead of prescribing an antidepressant, you could consider prescribing, say, 2 hours of time in nature in 20-minute increments, just because we have so much evidence that that's going to help with some of these problems. So, one really inspiring thing is I think that it's such a popular topic for students, I think, because it is very intuitive that this can be so powerful particularly for young people. There's a lot of evidence that early childhood experiences in nature be very formative in multiple ways, in terms of developing initiative and independence and healthy relationships, all sorts of healthy attitudes and abilities. Early childhood experiences in nature are also really an important part of increasing awareness and connection to nature and developing people who are going to integrate care for nature into their adult lives.
Absolutely.
I would say one of the things I really appreciate about environmental education or sustainability education is this idea that the goal is to create engaged members of society and to really equip students and equip learners with connection to and a care for nature, and then the ability and some skills to address the problems that they see. And that process of being engaged, having a more reciprocal relationship, not just looking at nature, not just saying, hey, nature is beautiful, but I am part of nature and it's my responsibility to work to protect or help to restore it or help to keep it safe and clean and vibrant, all of those things. I think that can be very powerful. And again, kind of coming back to this idea of nature not only as a source of like, oh, this is beautiful, but as a source of meaning.
Rachelle's work, Brit, really reminds me very strongly of some of the earlier episodes that we've recorded, particularly about the IPBES values assessment and also the report that we launched last year about the transformative change assessment. Making the point again, there are so many different kinds of benefits that we get from biodiversity beyond just materials and market value.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how she has this really great sort of example and core value that she likes to research and also, teach about, which is this idea of perspective. So who actually am I and how big are my problems? This idea of being around things that are older or bigger or grander or just something, add a comparative adjective of your choosing. But it lets us just have perspective of where we are in all of this.
Now, coming back to this idea of material and non-material values of nature. So you'll remember from the IPBES values assessment, the multiple values of nature, one of the things that assessment brought about was looking at different ways of relating to nature, whether you are living from nature, whether you're living in nature, whether you're living with nature, or whether you're living as nature. And I think a lot of the elements that Rachelle was talking about build into that, and the transformative change work that IPBES did last year, which was really looking at things like what drives biodiversity loss. And one of the findings was that the separation of people from nature, or from the rest of nature, or this idea that we are somehow dominant over all other parts of nature, is really a big part of the needed change for a really transformative approach.
Oh, big time. And that, I think, beyond values also goes to knowledge. So the things you are learning and experiencing directly influence those values, which then directly influence actually what nature itself might be gaining in this reciprocal idea. If we know more, we actually might benefit more. The idea of being present, we can actually extend that to our relationship with nature and the mindfulness aspect of that connection.
The comment that you made in the interview about the favorite place that you have and the geological formations and looking at things purely from a beauty perspective or from the perspective of the visual, and then adding to that the knowledge and what Rachelle talked about why it was such a great example, because with the knowledge that you had, the benefit that you were able to derive, the non-material benefit that you were able to derive, was so much deeper and so much more valuable.
I can tell you this much. If my general practitioner had to write me a Park RX prescription, I think sending me right out there to the Badlands would be a really easy one because, yeah, I mean, I cannot tell you the kind of difference in attitude, mental well-being, which then, of course, contributes to physical well-being, being in a place that I find both beautiful but also intellectually humbling and perspective giving.
It really resonates intuitively with you, the idea that there is such an important part of rest and recovery and recuperation that is based on connection to nature. So the idea that you can prescribe time in nature, it doesn't sound as revolutionary as perhaps it actually is in a lot of countries and in a lot of contexts. So it was nice to hear. Similarly, the idea of the early exposure to nature and giving particularly young people the opportunity to be engaged with nature early on and creating these engaged citizens by doing that.
You know, this leads us perfectly towards our second guest in this episode, who was in fact an author on that transformative change report. And I got to speak to him about reciprocal relationships of care with nature that have been handed down through generations. Nick Roskruge is a retired ethnobotany professor from New Zealand. He started by telling me about his own background.
My background is as an ethnobotanist, and specifically in the South Pacific, and I work with food crops primarily, in the reality of working in our Indigenous space. So I'm from New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand. My mother is Māori from Atiawa, my Ngāti Tama me Ngāti Porou. So my mother's side is all Māori, and I was brought up by my mother's parents. So, and I'm an old fella, so that's some time ago now, back in the 50s and the 60s. So that's me, mihi atu kia tai.
You have worked within a ton of different spaces relating to nature, but also science and education and policy. But what is, for you personally, that connection to nature?
From a personal space, it's what we call our whakapapa, which is the relationship that comes from our generations. So it's what's handed down generationally. From my karawa, my grandfather, to myself is what they teach you when you're young, the relationship you have to the place you grew up, to the people that live in that place where you grew up. And I guess over time you move from being the student to being the teacher. But the other side is that I've worked all my life on the whenua, on the land, so it's not something that you actually try and put a label or a boundary on. It's just something that's part of your everyday space.
What kind of opportunities do you have to be that teacher and passer of knowledge these days, as you mentioned?
Well, it seems to be a all-the-time thing now. We've just had a hui on the weekend, which was about 2 hours drive from here. They call them workshops at this time of the year because it's preparing people for the spring and for the summer. But it's constantly about just being accessible and sharing. And again, because I've come from both a practical and a teaching background, you sort of get put into that space to lead the conversation. And when we're starting to talk about the land and the food systems or the forest systems, most people have a relationship, some of them more than others, and it's just building that space for everyone.
Who is it that you're getting to work with primarily?
On a day-to-day basis, it tends to be the community at large. It's a mixture, but primarily the older ones supporting the conversation, and it's the younger ones we're taking the conversation to. So when I say younger, I'm saying 20s, 30s. So we sort of work as an older cluster, if you like, to ensure that information or the messaging is appropriate, because they are our successors. So that's in the Māori or the cultural space, but then there's also the mainstream sort of talks and lectures, which are again based at that young adult type primarily. This week I've got a talk at one of the schools. So they'll be 12 to 17, something like that. There's no set rule. It's whoever puts their hand up and says, can we spend some time with them?
What are some of the differences in the kind of messaging you are doing within this Māori and cultural identification space that might be different from the way someone might talk about botany or the land in a different way? How is this different?
Partly some of it is language, in that most of the communication is, if not in Māori, it's a combination of Māori and English. And the second is that aside from the teaching itself, is there's all those processes, the cultural processes you have to go through before you start sort of formally having conversations about different topics. And that's probably the most important, is that when you come in to a space that you move through a set of protocols which makes that space safe, but it's also what helps identify where the conversation, where the kōrero is coming from. So ensuring that we go through the rituals of coming together.
So if you could arrange our conversation in a way from the perspective you generally bring when you do this kind of educational outreach, what are some examples of things we might have done at the beginning of this talk?
So I preempted a little bit of that, because we will always start with what we call karakia, which is a type of prayer, I guess, but it's something that associates what we're about to do with the gods that we would ordinarily acknowledge. The second, and we did a little bit of it, is what we call whakawhanaungatanga, which is that we introduce each other. And from a Māori context, you always listen to see if you're related to the other side, because if you're related, it's an even stronger connection to just being a stranger that's coming from another area. As Māori, they'll always say, ko wai au, who are you, and who are your parents, and all of that, to identify how they connect to you. And it's a small country and it's a small world, and most often people find ways of connecting. So as soon as they've found that connection, bang, you're off.
I hear you mention relationship and relational value a lot in how you are discussing this kind of process. What are some of the benefits of a relational outlook or approach to messaging, especially when it comes to thinking about biodiversity and nature?
Well, the old people will tell you that it creates obligations, and that's not a bad thing, but it gives purpose or a reason for why you do what you do. So if we say, for example, that we are related to nature through the various processes of whakapapa, we identify them as our ancestors, so that relationship creates the obligation to look after them as if they were your whānau, your family. And then the next task is to support how you do it. So it creates that purpose for what you're doing without pushing people to say you have to do something. It becomes a moral, or it becomes a social obligation. And that's how, in a culture that in the old days wasn't written, was very much a verbal culture, and information was captured through carvings or through song or through proverbs and all of that. You needed mechanisms that created, that ongoing relationship, and that's what it does.
I can immediately think of so many ways that would benefit and create a happier and healthier Anthropocene. If we have an obligation, then the choices become much easier, and certainly there is more stewardship. I also, though, wonder how the students and the learners themselves benefit or grow by learning this sort of messaging.
I guess it depends on the scene or the scenario. So if it's an environment where it's totally in a cultural context, at the marae, it's a Māori context, then the people that are there have come to embellish, to build on what they already have. So they're looking to add, we say, to add to their kete, to their basket of knowledge. But even in a university environment, the good students are doing the same thing, probably in their own way. And sometimes they just need that exposure to realise these other layers of knowledge, that they're not competing, they're not knowledge systems that are telling them something else is wrong, but the layers of knowledge that add to their understanding of something. We've always said the perfect space for us at the end of the day is that our young people will be in all of the places, the policy, the practice, all of the roles, and they will, simply by being there, be able to share with all the other people. So it becomes a learning by immersion. Probably the key to what we do with the schools is that we take resources, plant resources and what have you, and the school might provide an area that's been prepared, and then we spend time sort of working through the different elements that come together. So you have the spiritual element, which has to be recognised and acknowledged. You have the physical, which is the soil and the plant material that we're going to work with, and talking about what you would call probably the provenance of the plants, which we would call hokapapa, so the genealogy, the descent, where that plant has come from, what its use is, is it used for special occasions, is it used for everyday meal, that sort of thing. So getting that whole story on the table. So the spiritual, that's the physical. There is what you would call the intellectual side, which we would say the hiningaro. Also there's that learning about the plant, and that's where the science comes in, is that we want to explore some of the things we can't see straight away. So what's its growth habit, what's wrong here, or what's happening to this plant, pest diseases, those sorts of things on the bush. And the last element, so there's that 4-piece approach, is the social component, and that it brings people together and it brings whānau in to add to the conversation. So it's not just us talking, it's the teachers or the parents that want to be involved. That's what we call whanaungatanga, which brings them in to contribute. So it becomes a more collective activity and program, and that's from a Māori point of view, that's how it should be. It should embrace all of those, the realms, I think they call it in Pākehā in English. So the spiritual, the physical, the intellectual and the social. At the end of the day, the old people will tell you that the world is circular, so what comes round goes round, and if you contribute into something, then eventually it contributes back. And that may be just through your well-being, just through your sense of having helped build a community of interest. So there's lots to gain, certainly from our point of view, with sharing knowledge and working with the young people coming through, because, that is our future.
What an incredible interview, Brit. I found it particularly interesting when Nick started with this idea that we have pre-existing relationships with nature, and what was important was to really build the space to build upon that pre-existing relationship. In some ways, this podcast is exactly about that, creating space to help us all build on our links to nature.
Yeah, I basically got a miniature lesson on this just by recording this podcast interview with Nick. He was mentioning things about how one might start and build relationship. We would have started by saying, who are you, right? Like, who are your parents? Are we potentially connected to one another? And, we can zoom out and apply that to nature itself. So, like, who are you? Who am I? Nature. Like, where are we related? Who are your parents? As in, where did you come from, this piece of natural world? And, like, where did I come from? And how should we act with one another?
Definitely. This idea of building stewardship through obligation, even at the level of family bonds to nature, I think also resonates with a lot of our listeners and a lot of communities. And for some, as we said before, it might not be the most familiar concept, but for many others, I think this is how the world works.
Yeah, and if it's not familiar, we also don't need to be afraid of it. Like Nick mentioned, for people who this isn't the main approach as far as this topic or relationships, like, don't be afraid of, incorporating small pieces.
One of the things that I did think about when Nick was talking was it's clear from his perspective, and particularly with the Māori approach, community is really at the center of caring for, understanding for land and the environment. But clearly, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, because community has a very different concept in many other cultures and many different countries, right? So, you talk about your experience with the students that you teach. Are you able to use that concept of community in a similar way?
Oh, absolutely. And here's why. So we are hardwired to connect to one another from what used to be survival. And, we can say, it's not just survive, it can be thrive. And so I think community exists as soon as you have more than one human. And it doesn't even have to be in the same space. You and I have still not met each other in person, right? And here we are with a 5-year built relationship and connectivity at this point. So I think that's also really important to note.
Yeah, I don't exist entirely in the virtual space, I promise. One of the things that is common to both of these interviews is really this idea that there are so many contributions, there's so many benefits that we as people receive from nature or experience by being in nature, But I really love the concept of the world as circular that Nick was talking about, where when we make contributions, whether those are contributions to community, whether those are contributions to society, or to land, or to nature, those contributions do come back. So from his perspective, sharing knowledge is key because he gets that back and the community gets that back. And it's what we do with the podcast. We share experiences, we share insights into nature with the hopes of trying to help bring some of that back into the community as well.
And when we know more about a thing, we make a relationship with a thing. And when we have a relationship with a thing, we protect and care for the thing. It's right there. So that's it for this episode of Nature Insight, Speed Dating with the Future. I'm Brit Garner.
And I'm Rob Spall. Join us on our next episodes to hear about how the latest technologies, like virtual reality, are helping women share their experiences of environmental degradation and climate change.
It's also where we explore the relationship between gender and biodiversity. In the meantime, you can learn more about IPBES's work on www.ipbes.net or on any of our social media channels. Just search for @IPBES. That's @IPBES. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Nature Insight wherever you get your podcasts.